Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mithc Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of cable television and how it has impacted politics. And while we will be talking about what ends up on the screen, we're also going to look at what happens behind the screen, including what happened and what happens in the legislative halls of Congress and how regulation and deregulation plays a critical role. My guest for this is Kathryn Cramer Brownell. She's Associate Professor of History at Purdue University, and she's the author of the book that she joins us to talk about. It's called 24/7 Politics, Cable Television, and the Fragmenting of America, from Watergate to Fox News. Kathryn Cramer Brownell, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was interested to learn from your book that the origins of cable television date back to the 1940s, which surprised me. I know that television itself has a history beginning really the start of the 20th century, but my mom, who was a kid in the 1950s, used to tell me how when they first time they got a television inside their house. So I was a bit surprised to learn about the origins and the beginning of cable television dating back to the 1940s. What was happening in the 1940s and what was cable then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so cable television really emerges with broadcast television. It becomes a way for people who are outside of being able to access the broadcast signals, which initially were in big cities like Chicago or New York. And so it becomes a way for someone who's maybe lives quite a distance, but can't access the signals due to terrain or distance, for them to access broadcast television. So there are early entrepreneurs who would climb to the top of a mountain to get that signal, and then they would relay that signal via a wire. And so the early version of cable television was actually called community television because it was about giving that community access to television that they wouldn't really have any access to otherwise.
Was it publicly owned?
No. So that's, one of those really interesting things in cable television's development. It could have gone a variety of different ways. In the beginning, it was someone who saw a business opportunity, had engineering experiences, could run those wires into homes from the top of a hotel, for example, and then charge a monthly fee. And so it was a business from the beginning.
So I suspect that is part of why we have this sort of different evolution of cable television compared to broadcasting television.
Well, initially, cable was just seen as an extension of broadcast, right? So it was just a service. It wasn't anything to challenge broadcast to provide something different. It was just to extend broadcasting's reach. And then it really develops, and there's a huge debate over what cable television could be in the 1960s as people begin to become frustrated with the limitations of broadcast television, which at the time is controlled by a monopoly of the big three, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And that's really about it.
Tell me more about broadcast television and this big three and how they present to the world. And when we say broadcast television, it's simple enough. It's like how people are hearing our conversation over the radio. It's broadcasted over the air and picked up by antennas. Tell me about the legacy of and tell me about the complaints at the time in the 1960s about broadcast television.
Yeah, so broadcast television always touted that it was free, right? You just needed to, you had those antennas, and once you had those antennas, then you didn't have to pay a monthly rate. And so they celebrated that this is, free TV is what broadcasters would call it. But it was heavily commercialized. Of course, people aren't paying out of their pockets each month for a subscription, but they are paying with their time during a lot of lengthy advertisements. And so there's a lot of criticism that it becomes more focused just on getting advertisers on board rather than actually fulfilling. The other component is its public interest role. Because broadcasters had a monopoly, they were regulated to have a monopoly. They argued that this allowed them to deliver better programming. It allowed them to make a lot of money too. But they had this public interest requirement that they also had to serve the broader public and contribute to the civic process. And they did that through the news. And so news and public affairs programming were a way that broadcasters showed that they were contributing to democracy, upholding their commitment to the public interest. But again, even those news programs were very limited in terms of what they saw as, and defined as the news. It was very exclusionary, very elitist from a white and male perspective as well.
It helped enforce this monoculture that we wouldn't have had before.
Warning, you could soon lose your job because of what's happening inside this building you see behind me.
Absolutely. It's very much about creating consensus, a shared culture. But the criticisms that emerge in the 1960s come from civil rights activists and feminists, from conservatives. People across the political spectrum, people were frustrated that this was a shared culture, but again, it was also exclusionary. And they wanted their voices and their perspectives to be involved. And so that's why they pushed for different forms of television, and cable emerged as a potential solution.
So are these groups, civil rights activists, feminists, conservatives, some of the different groups from each other, are they all involved in pushing for more cable television?
Yes, that's one of the really interesting things. The 1960s is this very divided time, and the people who are clamoring for cable television disagree on almost everything, but the need for more television access. And so this demand for more TV access really intensifies throughout the 1960s as it becomes clear that TV is shaping political discussions. TV is shaping legislation. TV is helping people win elections. And so that means that it's not just perhaps the president who overwhelmingly is controlling what becomes known as the televised bully pulpit. Members of Congress want to be on TV too. They see it as their path to power. Activists inside and outside of office want to be on TV. They see it as their path to power as well.
That's interesting. Why do they have to push for this? Why can't just a cable provider do it on their own?
Well, initially, there are regulations. Again, regulatory policy is so important and often really overlooked. During the 1960s, cable television was highly regulated. Those same regulations that gave broadcast networks that monopoly limited cable so that it could not compete with broadcasting. It could not provide an alternative. Cable operators couldn't even compete in the top 100 markets. So they could only extend the reach of broadcasting rather than offer something different that would compete with broadcasters. And this was because of federal policy. And so that's why the push to deregulate cable or to rethink regulatory policies, to maybe have it be federally funded or a nonprofit, all of these are really floating around in the late 1960s.
Cable was seen as the ability to strengthen participation in the democratic system.
Yes, that was initially many activists saw, again, access to TV programming, control over TV programming as central to a right of citizenship in this age of television. And so they pushed for more opportunities, which cable provided. On the other hand, you have cable operators who embrace this language of democracy. They see that criticizing network television, embracing kind of these democratic impulses can be very good for business because they're interested not so much in advancing democracy, but they're interested in throwing off these regulations that are really limiting the markets in which they can compete. And so they embrace this idea of cable as a democratic tool, as a political strategy.
Who were these cable companies then, and do we see them in the legacy? Do we see their legacy in cable companies today?
Oh, that's such a great question. Yes, if you kind of chart the trajectory, you can kind of see that there are a lot of mergers that happened. One of the really interesting things is that cable companies and broadcast companies, Hollywood studios, all of these things were separate entities because of ownership rules. You couldn't own all different media. You had to have one, right? And so you couldn't dominate the entire media marketplace. Well, that changes in the aftermath of 1996 and the Telecommunications Act. And so a lot of them merge. And so they aren't necessarily, they don't operate by the same name, but you can kind of trace their history back. For example, one of the companies that I look at in the book is TCI. And its executive, John Malone, is a huge player in cable television, especially moving into the 1980s. TCI becomes one of the biggest companies in the cable companies in the entire country, and then it later goes on to merge with a telephone company in the aftermath of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. So we don't know it as TCI today, but the legacy is still there. John Malone, the head of TCI, is still very involved. He was involved in getting CNN off the ground, and he's still involved in CNN as well.
What were the early regulations then? Is it in the 1960s when we get these regulatory changes?
This course is about systems and system thinking. We use system thinking.
So the major point, a turning point that I argue in my book, which I just find was one of the most exciting parts about my research, because it showed how important some of these political biases and political agendas are to shaping regulatory policy. And that is what happens under the Richard Nixon administration. In 1968, there are all sorts of different possibilities for cable's future. And indeed, Lyndon Johnson had a task force that he had compiled these research, and one of the recommendations was a federally funded infrastructure of developing cable television in that capacity. But then Richard Nixon comes into office, and Richard Nixon sees things differently. He sees the networks as biased and out to get him, and he wants to take them down, and he uses a variety of different tactics, but one of them is regulatory policy, and he embraces the deregulation of cable television as a part of his war on network television, and it really changes the trajectory, the regulatory trajectory for cable.
Did broadcasting television try to retaliate against Nixon? I mean, Nixon probably thought they started the whole fight, and maybe they even did. I don't know, but did that cause sort of a war between the presidency of the time of Nixon and cable television and broadcast television?
Yeah. Absolutely. Network executives had long had a very cozy relationship with the president. Many of them were friends with people like John F. Kennedy, and had a really collaborative and amiable relationship. Lyndon Johnson, Frank Stanton at CBS, he and Lyndon Johnson went way back, especially because Lyndon Johnson's wife owned broadcast stations in Texas, and so there's this really strong collaborative relationship between the presidency and the networks. That changes with Nixon. Nixon does not trust them. He's trying to break them up in terms of using antitrust policies as well. They're battling again over information and what stories can come out. And so there's this real battle between broadcasters and Nixon that emerges. But one of the key things that's difference between, of course, Nixon's battling the press as well, the printed press. But with broadcasters, because their money hinges on regulations, federal regulations, Nixon really had that upper hand in terms of he could threaten their livelihood, and he tried to.
But he did more than that, right? I mean, we get these regulatory changes during his presidency. Is this where we get the change that allows for cable owners to provide television themselves, whatever what is it? What is the change? Does it change now that they can bring different things other than what you get from ABC, NBC, CBS?
Do you love boating? Well, Freedom Boat Club makes boating easier than ever. At Freedom Boat
Yeah, so there are two different changes. One of them happens with the FCC that's really not linked to Nixon, but is really linked to this pressure for more television activists or access. And that is local origination, what becomes later known as cable casting. And that is just a requirement that is imposed by the FCC that cable companies that are the larger ones need to come up with their own programming. So this is not connected at all with Nixon's regulatory battles. Rather, it's just out of this more grassroots push for more television access. So that is one change. So there is this mandate that cable companies have to think, what are we going to put on TV? The other one is opening up markets so that, and this is where it's more linked to Nixon, allowing cable operators to compete against broadcasters in these top 100 markets. Those policies really start to change, facilitating the franchise process for cable operators, really kind of cutting some of the red tape that had made it so difficult for them to make money in some of the bigger markets.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Kathryn Cramer Brownell. She's Associate Professor of History at Purdue University, and she joins us for a conversation about her book called 24/7 Politics, Cable Television and the Fragmenting of America, from Watergate to Fox News. Watergate, how does Watergate fit into your story?
So one of the really fascinating archival finds I came across was actually in the Gerald Ford Library. And I was looking at the aftermath of, so Nixon introduces all of these new regulatory policies for television, as part of this broader war that he's launching against the broadcast networks. Well, now Gerald Ford and his administration is trying to deal with all of these proposed changes. Nothing actually happened in terms of policy change. Like, there are a couple of regulatory policies, smaller ones that start to creep in, but the big vision that Nixon had was really halted by Watergate. Because there was so much attention to, Nixon's abuse of power, that Watergate really derailed a lot of the momentum that his Office of Telecommunications Policy had built towards changes with cable, and it really stalled. So Gerald Ford's administration is now trying to figure out what to do, and if they should move forward on something that had become tainted as part of Nixon's anti-media politics, even though it had broad support for expanding cable television. So they're trying to figure out what to do, and I found these documents. They had economists that came and talked about regulatory policy for cable, and they used the Watergate hearings as a rationale that, wow, if we actually have public affairs programming and a different option from network television, more people will watch television. It's actually not necessarily going to destroy the networks. It's going to expand people's obsession with television. And so Watergate really starts to reshape the regulatory trajectory in unanticipated ways that allows Nixon's kind of vision for cable to come to fruition 10 years down the road.
Again, the promise of cable, at least in its campaign, is to expand democratic participation. Did it do that?
It did. I think it does, especially in the early years, where there is so much excitement in local communities about the ability to get on TV and to whether it's to connect with their peers or their elected officials locally, or later on you see a variety of different experiments to engage women, to engage Black communities, to engage conservatives, things like C-SPAN. People flocked isn't the right term, but people turned to C-SPAN for this sense of community and a conversation that they could not get on network news programming. And so I think that there is this democratic impulse. But what I argue in the book is it's also always tied to advancing the business of television. And so it's hard to separate them. Sometimes they can work together, but when it comes down to advancing democracy or making money, cable companies are going to make money.
Tell me about this latter point.
So, I mean, you see this time and time again. A lot of these initiatives to kind of show cable's civic potential are linked to these regulatory battles. C-SPAN is a great example. C-SPAN emerges as a way that Brian Lamb comes up with this incredible vision that comes out of the Watergate hearings as well, right? Like that the televised Senate hearings showed, wow, that was a really important role that television played.
We can broadcast hearings. We can broadcast Congress just unfiltered as it is, which they do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's really interesting. The hearings were broadcasted on network television and public television. And so it's the networks that really step up during this time and show the value, the democratic value of providing transparency, providing more information, allowing people to see the process play out during a constitutional crisis. And so that legacy, Brian Lamb really taps into to sell this concept of C-SPAN, because in the aftermath of Watergate, the House and the Senate, they're trying to figure out how can we keep the spotlight on us now that it's not a crisis. So C-SPAN comes as a solution. And Brian Lamb, sells C-SPAN to cable operators by saying, if you want to be taken seriously in Washington, you need to do public affairs. That's the power that the networks had. They had power because they do the news. And so if you want to have political power to kind of change legislation, you need to do something like C-SPAN. And so it works. They invest in the cable companies, invest in C-SPAN. It is a really important component of giving Americans information and connecting them to their government. But it's also tied with that deregulatory battle that they're fighting as well.
Yeah, as a political reporter, I have relied heavily on C-SPAN. I've done my own hours and hours of viewing C-SPAN, but there is this other side to it that it has been, I guess we could say, exploited.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the interesting things, is that you introduce this new medium to Congress, to or the House first, and you've got representatives, especially younger ones, that firmly believe that television is a path to power. And they see this not as a chance to communicate and give information to their constituents, but as a way to build their brand. And so they manipulate the cable television in Congress very explicitly. And someone like Newt Gingrich, he saw that, wow, maybe not a ton of people are watching, but even if 500,000 people are watching, I can get my message out. I can build a national following. And so he and a variety of other more extremist members of Congress in the early 1980s start to use C-SPAN to attack their enemies and frame it as an attack, right? And call into question the patriotism of their of political opponents. And they're using this language of war almost, because that's how they're thinking about politics, as warfare, and using C-SPAN as a tool. They're doing this in the after hours, special orders time. So special orders happen when the House business is done. No one is there.
Everyone's gone home, except for the clerk.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But you can, as a member of Congress, you can go, or as a member of the House, you can go and deliver a speech, request time for special orders. Traditionally, this had been used for someone to perhaps put in the congressional record, like a happy anniversary to someone in their home district. Gingrich uses it differently. He knows the camera's only focused on him, so he launches into these attacks using very outlandish statements and really emotional language, if you will. And people think that, oh, no one's responding, it must be true. Well, no one was responding because no one was in the chamber. And so it really was that manipulation of cable for a political agenda.
I was a Capitol Hill reporter about 20 years ago, and I remember coming home, be late at night, I'd have C-SPAN on, and there'd be like 3 Republican lawmakers just going on and on between themselves. And I always thought, and I didn't fully grasp at the time what was going on, but you see it now in retrospect. They were communicating not to a big audience, because C-SPAN doesn't have a huge audience anyways, but especially around midnight. But there is a dedicated audience that they are talking to, and that was deliberate.
Exactly. And the idea was that we don't need to appeal to the majority. We don't need to create consensus. We need to get a very dedicated minority ready to go, ready to mobilize, ready to work for campaigns, to donate for causes. And so it's this idea of narrowcasting. That's what cable does, thinking about stitching together the quote unquote right demographics, people who are more committed, more passionate, rather than trying to broadcast, right, which is appeal to the lowest common denominator and build consensus. And so really, cable really is instrumental in ushering in that shift towards narrowcasting and making politicians see the value of that. And again, this is a political strategy that the lobbyists are hosting workshops for elected officials to say, here's how you narrowcast, here's how you segment the market, here are the tools that we use to attract advertisers. Why not bring them into your campaigns?
Is this democracy? And I ask that because in paying close attention to the history of democracy, it's actually part of democracy for groups to try to exploit the democratic rules. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We all do it. Lobbyists do it. I mean, absolutely. From activists do it. Everyone does it.
Mm-hmm. I think it absolutely is. And I think that it's part of how we function in a televisual democracy, that thinking about how you present an image, thinking about messaging, how it's going to come across, how to build these electronic coalitions, that is central to how our politics function today. Mm-hmm.
I've also hosted on radio for our network countless congressional hearings over the last 20 years, and it has become very clear that congressional hearings are now seen as opportunities, bring on the internet, opportunities to get your soundbite or meme out there. And really, rather than having a hearing trying to get to the bottom of an issue, it's really about using your 5 minutes you may have as a lawmaker in that hearing to say something, to hope that it goes viral and helps either push yourself or your issues. Brian Lamb is interesting. He's as a broadcaster, he is somebody that I actually admire quite deeply, and he is also an advocate for putting cameras in the Supreme Court, which I used to 100% be behind.
Do you know the U.S. solar company's nasty little secret? It turns out if you live in California, they have to give you...
But I do question that now, after seeing how television cameras, and it's, okay, so you don't have television cameras in congressional meetings or in the Hill. Now you're blocking everyone out from being able to watch at all. So there's another side to this. But I do kind of see an argument now why you wouldn't want cameras in the Supreme Court, because it may turn, some argue it already is, but it could turn the Supreme Court into a spectacle the way that kind of congressional hearings have become.
Well, when you put TV in some place, people are aware of TV. They're aware of it, and maybe they forget about it at some, if it's the entire day. But I think that what we learn with C-SPAN is that when you put cameras in, people start performing for the cameras. They start thinking again, even though the goal for those cameras, that I know that Brian Lamb believed in, was this importance of transparency, of getting the whole story. But again, there's always that line between transparency and manipulation. Is really thin, and you see that time and time again.
Could you have one without the other?
Oh, that's a really great question, and I honestly think that in our politics today, where it's so performative, and this is not just today. Of course, performance has a long history in politics, but it's so performative for television, for social media, to get these ratings, that it's really hard to think about just that you're just giving information, because how the information is delivered, what is delivered, right? Even though you can push for like the full transparency, you're not always giving everything, right? It's impossible. So how you're selecting it, how you're presenting it, how you're framing it, even though you can try to say, this is me, this is, the full, all the information, it's always selected.
Yeah, I try to warn people to always, be a bit critical of whatever they hear in media, even on my Absolutely. Radio program or whatever, because even the best well-intentioned attempt to get to a story is always going to miss nuance and complexity. Just the medium itself is limited from understanding all the motivations that would go into whatever one is following.
hmm Absolutely. And I think that's the important thing to know is, and that's so essential for navigating our current media moment, is having that media literacy and knowing what you're getting and what you're not, and being able to decipher that. And I think one of the challenges with cable television is that whether it's 24/7 news, whether it's C-SPAN, there's this air of authenticity and transparency that you're getting it because it's nonstop and there's so much information that's out there. But in fact, it's just a different filter. It's a different filter from what we were getting in broadcast. It's perhaps more information, but it's still being curated in that way by people who are trying to control their image, right? They're trying to get their message out. But now cable just kind of changed those dynamics of how they do it. But that process is still in play.
Does the fairness doctrine fit in to your narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the fairness doctrine is really comes out of decades long work by conservative activists, but really it's interesting in the 1980s. It fits into this deregulatory moment that cable. Its deregulation is rooted in the 70s, and then it really kind of takes off in the 1980s as both Democrats and Republicans embrace this idea of deregulating the media environment. Ultimately, Ronald Reagan's FCC chairman, Mark Fowler, he really pulls back any kind of regulatory oversight over both cable companies, but also broadcasters. So he kind of tells them, like, I'm not really paying attention whether or not you are serving the public interest. And in fact, he makes this argument that the public's interest is the public interest. And so that consumerism, what they want to consume should be what the goal. And so he allows for many mergers to happen between media companies as part of this deregulation. And then, of course, the fairness doctrine is something that comes out that he kind of makes it. He really kind of pulls it back and says, we're no longer enforcing the fairness doctrine. What's really interesting is that there is a bipartisan coalition majority in Congress that passed legislation to return the fairness doctrine because they understand the benefits that gives. Democrats, if they're appearing, the fairness doctrine is often invoked to say, well, we need a Republican on the other side. And so they actually understand that there are certain benefits to the parties that it lends. But ultimately, Ronald Reagan vetoes the legislation. And so it really sends the fairness doctrine into a relic of the past and really allows for more partisan television and on broadcast, on radio, of course, and on cable to flourish during the 1990s. This
radio program broadcasts on Pacifica Radio Network, which is an old public radio lefty station. And when I talked to the old timers, I wasn't around when with the fairness doctrine. The old timers were also against the previous rules, saying that, well, before you only got one story that was controlled by the big networks. And what we wanted to be was a counterweight to what was being put out there on mainstream to give a different perspective. And I think there was value to that and truth to that, because like as you mentioned, what was put out there was a very small window, a very small frame of what was allowed. But looking at it today and sort of just going back to how media works today and in the lack of complexity and nuance, almost everything is either you're telling the absolute truth or you're an absolute liar or it's corrupt and again, that's why I always try to caution people, be careful, because stories are always more nuanced and complex than what you're being told, even under the best circumstances, but we're not operating in the best circumstances anymore.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best way to make money on Amazon is not.
Well, and part of the issue is that we are in a deregulated media environment where the consumer interest has become conflated with the public interest. And that means that news companies are not thinking about any civic obligation they have to present nuance or complexity. They're thinking about making money. There are no rules, there are no expectations in place in terms of kind of pushing good behavior, pushing any kind of adherence to kind of this public interest. It's all about what sells. It's all about ratings. And so I think that's why you see, very outlandish uses and statements on, whether it's a cable news program or whether it's social media. It's all about getting ratings. And I think part of what cable does, the deregulation of cable television and of media more broadly, it ties the democratic process to the marketplace. And I really would also emphasize that this is not just a Republican. We think of deregulation as a Republican agenda, but it's actually Al Gore who is saying that the consumer interest and the public interest are one and the same, right? This is a bipartisan thing that people across the political spectrum have bought into and have made that our reality.
The Telecommunications Act of 1996, signed into law by Democratic President Bill Clinton.
Exactly. And that is this major regulatory hurdle that completely deregulates cable companies and allows them to merge and compete against telephone companies in terms of different services, but also work with internet providers, different tech firms out in Silicon Valley. And so you see this merger and the idea, Gore pitches it that this is an opportunity for corporate citizenship to emerge and allow different choice for consumers that, they can choose whether to go with Comcast or AT&T. But the reality is that these companies all merge. And so, yes, you do have maybe a slight choice, but you kind of have, in terms of ownership of the media systems, it's a different type of monopoly in the aftermath because of the marketplace, not because of regulation.
Let's talk more about the marketplace, and I think we certainly see it today with online media, which is really governed by clicks. And we know that the more extreme a piece, an article or a video may be, or more edgy a video or whatever it may be is, the more likely it is to get clicks. The more clicks it gets, the more it shows up in everyone else's algorithm. And this is what ends up getting pushed. I mean, we see this in cable. I expect we see it today as well on the internet.
I think this is one of the legacies of cable television emerging as this deregulated medium, because it becomes about how can we get, again, this very small but loyal and impassioned audience. And it allows for experimentation, right? So some of that experimentation can be productive. CSPAN, an experiment, right? In terms of providing more information, connecting Americans to their government, if they choose to. But overwhelmingly, people are choosing other options. They're choosing, the edgier programs that come out on the cable dial. They're maybe even becoming a little bit more lazy in terms of expecting their favorite channel like MTV to deliver not just music videos, but also information about the world around them. Well, what does that mean to MTV executives? They're delivering news as a business strategy. They get involved in the 1992 election because they don't want their viewers to change the dial. They don't want them to go to ABC or NBC or CBS. So they get involved in covering politics, but they're only covering a small slice of politics. They're thinking about, they're pandering their coverage to what they think their audience wants. And I think it's not just the ratings obsession, but it's that pandering of the news to attract a particular demographic that has really shaped how cable news developed in the 1990s and into today.
I mean, MTV was very beneficial to Bill Clinton's candidacy, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So MTV gets involved in the 92 election, and it's offering candidates like, they're trying. Tabitha Soren is going to New Hampshire trying to interview people, and many people running for office don't take MTV seriously. In fact, George H.W. Bush, just dismissed it and called it a teeny bopper network. But Bill Clinton, again, he's willing to do anything. It's June of 1992. He's secured the Democratic nomination, but it's before the convention. His campaign is just floundering. And so he's desperate. He's willing to do any media opportunity that comes up. And so he says yes to MTV. And he just thrives in that setting. It's that kind of town hall setting where he can talk around, build on his strength in terms of making connections to individuals. But it's so important that he is controlling the conversation. He is controlling their discussion of current events, not just his campaign, but these current controversies around his campaign. He's able to dismiss them and say, no, here's the real issue. And so it's not just using entertainment to make a quick cameo appearance like on Saturday Night Live or something. It's using entertainment to really shape people's understanding of public affairs more broadly.
Tabitha Soren, you're really taking me back now.
Absolutely. She, played such a powerful role in the 92 election. And then, in the Clinton administration goes back to her, has a town hall with her when they're talking about their legislative agenda. And so, she appears time and time again throughout the Clinton administration.
Obviously, it would be a different kind of politics. Do you see this as a precursor to the rise of Fox News?
It's interesting that I would in some capacities, because I think it's part of looking at the news as creating a brand. And using the news as entertainment, right? It's framed as MTV News, but it's actually about advancing a brand, and like I said, kind of pandering to what they thought their audiences wanted to hear. And so CNN is a lone player in terms of the 24-hour news or cable channel. It comes on the scene in 1980, and it's not until 1996 that you get MSNBC and Fox News. But one of the really interesting things around the launch of MSNBC and Fox News is they're all talking about what their brand is, what's going to be their take on the news. And so MSNBC initially wants to appeal to a younger audience, kind of like MTV, that they want their shows to be hip. They have a lot of younger people. They're connected to the internet, right? And so they're very tech savvy, and that people can reply to the news story online. And so they're kind of trying to embrace that as their brand. Fox, of course, takes on the brand that has proven very successful in talk radio with figures like Rush Limbaugh. That what if we make ourselves conservative? We emphasize fair and balanced, and fair and balanced to conservatives meant something very distinctive, and that meant a conservative take on the news.
Is Fox conservative because its founders are deeply conservative, or it could be multiple reasons, but or was it also for ratings? Was it also for market?
The ancient Egyptians understood that they could use sound to reduce their weight.
I think Fox has been successful because it's brought in money. It's grown and become so dominant in GOP politics because it's been this lucrative business, and it could not really become the giant that it is now if it didn't make money. And so its founders, yes, they were conservative. They believed in a conservative mission, but for them it was always about business first, and this proved profitable, and then it kind of served their politics as well.
And of course, when we say doing it for the market, whether we're talking about, again, online media or cable media, what we mean by doing it for the market means this is where people are flocking to.
It means it's about, cable as a business makes money in two different ways. It makes money off of advertisements that, just like broadcasting did. It, initially cable says that we won't have any advertisements. And then they see, oh, we can make money off of advertisements. And so advertisements can become or have been a source of funding. But more significantly, it makes money off of carriage fees. And so they negotiate with cable operators a certain fee to carry their programs per household. And so ESPN, as you may not be surprised, makes the most money off of carriage because there's such a demand. But it's that creating that demand where enough cable subscribers are going to insist that they had Fox News on, or they would, or they would drop that service. And so it was that fine line between cultivating that loyalty where people would demand their cable operators to make sure that they could have access to something like Fox News.
What is public access TV?
Oh, such a great question. So public access TV is, again, part of this promise that cable television brings in the late 60s and in the 1970s. And in fact, public access starts to flourish in places in places like California. There's this countercultural impulse on public access, where, again, it's an opportunity for ordinary citizens to make their own films and get their message out there. And so it's part of something that's negotiated with, there were FCC rules mandating that each cable operator had a public access channel, at least one. But then it really comes down to, with deregulation later on, it comes down to the negotiation between the cable company and the local government during the franchise process. So there's no guarantee, but cable companies needed to, in the 1980s, get these franchise agreements where they could, dig up the streets and lay the wire, and actually provide those wires to get the TV into households. And so that could become a political negotiation, that they had to provide this amount of a number of channels for the local government for public access as well.
Almost like, well, in different ways, but similar to C-SPAN, though. For us to be able to meet sort of the public good, or what we're going to put into it, you get C-SPAN and you get public access TV.
Exactly. That this is an opportunity for citizens to use it and to have access to it. Many of these public access agreements initially, or the franchise agreements initially, pledged that cable companies would build studios to allow, because an average person doesn't, this is way before, iPhones. So the average person didn't have access to a TV studio. So what good did carriage help if you couldn't actually put together a video? And so many cable companies initially promised that they would build TV studios, production studios for local citizens. Many of them reneged on those promises. And again, this is part of the consequence of deregulation. When you're not mandating that anymore, companies can just say, sorry.
In the age of the internet, does cable matter anymore?
It does. I think it matters. And it's helpful to think about cable and its legacy in a variety of ways. So cable companies like Comcast, they provide the internet. They provide the broadcast. They've got this national wired infrastructure that allows for wireless access that we've all become dependent on. They've diversified, and so now they're looking at a variety, like they're looking beyond just television. But those cable companies still matter, because that's part of how we get our internet today. In terms of programming, then you have this other side. So there's always been this hardware side, right? The actual infrastructure, the wired infrastructure. And then there's the software, the programming. And I think that, the future of many cable programming programs and networks is really, that's what's really at a turning point. Many of them are succeeding with subscription services, but others are struggling to survive. And so I think that's where we really see kind of this debate over the future of things like CNN or Fox or C-SPAN or ESPN or some of the entertainment or sports program, HBO, all of these things. Some of them are flourishing, others are struggling. And I think, C-SPAN is actually a great example of one that's struggling because as people are turning to internet, not cable, and they're cutting the cord, now C-SPAN, which was funded by carriage fees, is struggling in terms of to survive financially.
Oh, interesting. But isn't cable still required to provide C-SPAN? I always thought it was the cable companies that floated the bill for C-SPAN.
They do float the bill, but they float the bill by charging a per subscriber fee. Right now, I think it's around 8 cents. I could be wrong. But initially it was 3 cents. But it's now, no, it's got to be more than 8 cents. But anyway, I'm not sure the exact details of what they charge now. But they charge for every subscriber, this small percentage goes to funding C-SPAN. Well, when more people are cutting the cord and opting for internet, there's not that requirement on internet services. It's only if you have a cable package.
And you don't need C-SPAN anymore to watch Congress. All the committees stream their hearings on their website.
If tuna is one of the healthiest and leanest protein you can eat, then why are we eating more of it? We'll tell you exactly why.
I think some committees do, but many of them, again, C-SPAN has been so reliable in terms of getting us congressional information. Their camera crews are experienced in terms of all of, so they've become part of the infrastructure. So how it is funded in the future is really an important question.
And isn't it cable companies that are actually providing many of us now with our internet connection?
Yes, yes, many. I think the majority of the broadband market is controlled by cable companies today.
So that's their way of holding on to power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the private infrastructure that they built to deliver wired television is now being used to, they're going to continue to innovate and to think about how they can deliver new technology that is faster, right? So you went from cable, a coaxial wire to digital, where now all of a sudden you can have hundreds of channels rather than just 50 or 60. And that was a technological improvement. And now it's providing broadband and faster services. And so again, the cable company will continue to innovate to become that essential resource because their business model is centered on it.
This is a bit off topic as I move to wrap up here, but it bothers me so much I want to bring it up. I feel as though digital rules about broadcast television has ruined broadcast television. If you get a great signal, I have an antenna on my TV. If you have a great signal, it's a beautiful picture that you get. But if there's any problem, any disruption whatsoever, instead of like the old days, you get a little squiggly line or a little snow in the image. Not a big deal. As I was a kid, that's what I grew up with. You get used to it. Not a big deal at all. Now it just completely blocks itself out. I mean, it makes it impossible to watch. And I really resent that I feel like it's almost impossible now to get free TV anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have not paid, or I have paid for television almost my entire life, and so I think that people have become accustomed to it, and then they can kind of make some of these regulatory policies that don't mandate that they do some of these free services because people don't cause controversy around it, right? If people rose the question, if millions of Americans demanded some change, then elected officials might rethink policy. But I think over the last 20 years, people have come to expect that they will pay for television.
Kathryn Cramer Brownell has been our guest. Again, she's Associate Professor of History at Purdue University, and she has joined us for a conversation about her book called 24/7 Politics, Cable Television, and the Fragmenting of America from Watergate to Fox News. Kathryn Cramer Brownell, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.